Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist on November 12, 2024. Since Israel's genocide in Gaza began last year, defenders of Palestinian human rights have experienced levels of repression not seen since the era of McCarthyism. In Canada, one of the most notorious cases in the past year was that of Dr. Yipeng Ge. In November of last year, Dr. Ge was suspended from the University of Ottawa. At the time of his suspension, Dr. Ge had been a fourth-year public health and preventive medicine resident and was completing a residency at the Public Health Agency of Canada. The suspension appears to have been precipitated by Dr. Yoni Friedhoff, an associate professor of family medicine at the University of Ottawa. On his Substack page, Friedhoff drew attention to a number of Dr. Ge's social media posts about Palestine, which Friedhoff falsely characterized as anti-Semitic. They included a post saying, quote, "Ottawa standing with Gaza," close quote, and featuring a photo of a sign stating, quote, "From the rivers to the sea, Palestine will be free," close quote. Friedhoff called that particular chant genocidal because, according to him, it implies the elimination of the state of Israel. An online petition calling for Dr. Ge's reinstatement garnered more than 100,000 signatures. It expresses solidarity with Dr. Ge for advocating for the human rights of Palestinians and called for the university to reverse the suspension. It also called for an apology and a thorough investigation of the decision to suspend him. Dr. Ge was subsequently reinstated by the University of Ottawa, but he refused to return there. He then traveled to Gaza with a team of Canadian doctors and spent several weeks in Gaza treating Palestinians in need of medical treatment. Now here to discuss all of these events with me is Dr. Ge himself. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Ge.
Thank you so much for having me, Dimitri.
So first off, Dr. Ge, how do you respond to Dr. Friedhoff's characterization of your social media posts regarding Palestine, and particularly from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free?
I mean, to respond, I think to some of these, bad faith actors, is an interesting thing to begin with. I personally don't think we should be giving any credibility, any space to having these kinds of conversations. It's a whole-hearted distraction from the ongoing genocide that is unfolding in Gaza. And so I have consistently tried to pivot, but also focus my energy to where it's needed, to center Palestinian human rights, to center Palestinian narratives, and to tell the story of what's unfolding in Gaza as an ongoing genocide as a consequence of the ongoing Nakba that began 76 years ago. The ways in which these colleagues who are so deeply entrenched in their Zionist, white supremacist, racist ideologies and worldviews, there's no changing. I don't think those kinds of worldviews or ideologies at this point. That's not where my energy is being directed, and unfortunately, we're seeing the kind of depraved actions of these bad faith actors in the viciousness and how vile and malicious they are in trying to attack an individual's character and integrity when they're really just sharing facts or sharing the truth or sharing standing in solidarity with people who demand liberation from structural oppression and colonization, and to kind of give any kind of space for that kind of racist, dehumanizing rhetoric. I just do not have any more time or energy for. And what we're seeing now with how vile and malicious this is getting, it's only because the cracks of Zionism are just so blown wide open with how we know the material conditions and the realities of how Palestinians experience Zionism and Zionist settler colonialism on the ground is genocide, is apartheid, is a brutal military occupation that dispossesses, displaces, and forces people out of their homes, off their territories.
You know, I must say, Dr. Ge, I'm very gratified that you answered my question in that way, because I've long been of the view that precisely what you said about these smear campaigns and these flagrantly false allegations of anti-Semitism. Of course, there's real anti-Semitism out there, but the types of allegations that are leveled against Palestinian rights defenders nowadays are beyond absurd. And I've often been of the view that even when the Israel lobby ultimately loses a debate about whether some event or statement is anti-Semitic, in a sense, it wins because the debate itself distracts us from the horrors of what is being done to the Palestinian people. And I think that that's actually a conscious strategy on the part of pro-Israel lobby groups, is to keep the public's attention focused on invented drama around the alleged anti-Semitism of Palestinian rights defenders, so that people don't focus on the crimes of Israel. And in fact, we saw that in Technicolor this week, during the past week, when there were allegations made of pogroms in Amsterdam, even though it was quite clear, based upon the evidence, that Israeli genocidal football hooligans had rampaged through the streets of Amsterdam and had provoked some violence. And I thought that, so much oxygen was sucked up by that conversation that very few people in Canada paid attention to the horrors that was inflicted, not just on the Palestinians, but the Lebanese last week. So I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to move on to the question of accountability for the person who weaponized allegations of anti-Semitism against you, namely Dr. Yoni Friedhoff. Because, as I mentioned at the outset, the University of Ottawa reinstated you, I think we can quite safely infer that the decision makers there came to the conclusion that Friedhoff's allegations were false. It seems to me, as a lawyer, that when somebody, particularly a medical professional, makes such a grave allegation falsely against a fellow member of the profession, there should be consequences. Do you agree with that? And if so, are you aware whether there's been any accountability whatsoever for Friedhoff, even a reprimand from his colleagues in the medical profession?
Not that I'm aware of. I've had conversations with senior leadership at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine that were responsible for handling my internal complaint that I shared right away when this other doctor affiliated with the faculty and with the university publicly doxed me and said, libelous, defamatory, and hateful remarks about me in a public forum. And so I took it internally into this kind of bullying and harassment kind of complaint process. And internally, I was told that the only kind of accountability that they really asked of him was to stop posting about me moving forward, which he hasn't done. And there was, a question of, I asked the question to, the faculty affairs vice dean, who was responsible for managing my complaint against him, that shouldn't you ask him to take these hateful comments and remarks down, especially, after the committee had even investigated and whatnot, the professionalism committee within the institution, they had investigated me and found nothing to maintain those accusations that the university actually took seriously. They said, "Oh, okay." It didn't even cross our mind to ask him to take those posts down. And when they did ask him, they came back to me and said, "Why did you put me in this position? Why did I ask you to do your job to hold this, professor within the institution who has power and privilege over learners? Why did I ask you to do your job to hold someone accountable?" And so the ways in which I'm seeing senior leadership within the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa not have any backbone whatsoever to stand up to these kinds of bad faith actors, these kinds of colleagues who are weaponizing anti-Semitism. And I think I do want to make a note that if we want to talk about anti-Semitism, I think we need to be able to situate it within understanding how far-right white supremacist movements are very much pushing anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes and racism. But when we focus on Israel, when we focus on any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, it actually completely makes everyone not safe, especially Jewish people in the diaspora. I have many Jewish friends and colleagues and comrades within this Palestine organizing, space that continue to teach me so much about situating anti-Semitism within the broader context of structural oppression. That oppression in any form is a threat and danger to all of us, and to kind of section it out and to also focus almost entirely the energy on dissuading or silencing any criticism of Israel is something that we should all be absolutely concerned about, and is a freedom of expression issue amongst many other issues, including the protection of anyone to defend human rights anywhere in this world. And we're seeing that play out with blatant anti-Palestinian racism and rhetoric and actions here on occupied Turtle Island.
So you talked a moment ago about the inadequacy of the University of Ottawa's response. On the 15th of January, the School of Epidemiology and Public Health announced with some fanfare that you had been reinstated. What they said was they were thrilled to welcome you back, and they referred to you as an outstanding learner and colleague. But ultimately, you didn't return. Why is that?
So I had meetings with closed-door meetings, some one-on-one meetings with the people that made the decision to ultimately suspend me. These were people very high up within the administration, which included the Dean of Medicine at the Faculty of Medicine, the senior vice deans, that felt the need to hold an emergency meeting on a Saturday to look at my social media post after it was sent in by that community member, that other family doctor who's affiliated with the faculty. And so I met with them individually to find a path forward, right? If you're going to take these accusations of anti-Semitism, of social media posts that stood for Palestinian human rights, if you're going to take those accusations seriously and investigate, and then the investigating committee actually disagreed completely with those accusations, recommended immediate reinstatement without any disciplinary action, actually went as far as to recommend an apology from the university to me, which still has not been delivered. And then to have those conversations with those senior officials who made that immediate decision way back in November of last year, to find a path forward. And what I really wanted was an acknowledgement of anti-Palestinian racism within this institution, because I also saw other cases. I sat on faculty council. This is the highest governing committee for the Faculty of Medicine as a resident representative. And I saw cases of multiple medical students and their social media posts. And I was like, do you not see this McCarthyist witch hunt happening? Really, with the framing of rooted in anti-Palestinian racism. And to see, blatant anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian hate and rhetoric shared within those spaces, this like a committee of 40, 50 of the leading, academic educators and administrators within the Ottawa region for like future physicians is just so appalling that I felt like the dean, the senior vice dean, they very much needed to have some kind of process to protect learners from anti-Palestinian racism that is so systemic and ingrained and being perpetuated and upheld by this institution, by an academic institution that's supposed to educate medical learners like future doctors. And so that was one piece. And certainly the other piece was an apology to me. And neither of these things could be fulfilled. And I had the dean of medicine even say, well, we can't do those things, but we can do other things. We could, pay for like leadership courses to help you, in your advocacy. And so it's just so disingenuous to see them almost find ways to kind of bribe me to stay because I explained to them that these were things that were absolutely necessary for my colleagues, my friends, staff, and faculty at the university to feel more respected and more safe in operating within this colonial medical institution. Because we know the roots of medicine is that as well. Um, and they couldn't do that. And so just really disappointing meetings. And I met, with the dean of medicine twice to find a path forward. And unfortunately, there was no path forward that I could really stomach in terms of finding a way to stay within the institution to be able to have my name be affiliated with the institution. So I would rather not. And so I'm going to dedicate my time and energy, as I have been over the past couple of months, to communities and initiatives and projects that deserve my time and labor.
As you may know, Dr. G, on October 10th of this year, about a month ago, a UN Commission of Inquiry found that Israel had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, including the crime against humanity of extermination in Gaza by attacking health facilities and also through its grotesque abuses of detainees and hostages. And I'm quoting from the October 10th press release of the Independent Commission of Inquiry. Israel has perpetrated a concerted policy to destroy Gaza's healthcare system as part of a broader assault on Gaza, committing war crimes and the crime against humanity of extermination with relentless and deliberate attacks on medical personnel and facilities. And of course, prior to this conclusion having been reached, we saw abundant evidence that Israel was doing just that it was attacking in a systematic way the healthcare system of Gaza. And in light of this evidence, I just it boggles the mind that any member of the legal profession in this country would not only remain silent in the face of what is being done to the healthcare system of Gaza, but actually, in a way, facilitate it by vilifying any member of the medical profession who speaks out against these crimes. And you, in fact, not only did not return to the University of Ottawa, you also resigned from the board of directors of the Canadian Medical Association. What was the background of that particular decision?
Yeah, I mean, it all happened really clustered and overlapping in its timelines because when that physician who publicly doxed me in early November, he also sent those social media posts to the Canadian Medical Association, for which I was the sole resident physician board member of back then and in fall of last year. And so I received a text from someone within the Canadian Medical Association. They said it was really urgent matter, and for to give them benefit of the doubt at the time, I really thought it was them reaching out to provide support, to say, hey, there's a bad faith actor here that's saying really awful things about you. How can we support you? It turns out I had that meeting with, the CEO of the Canadian Medical Association, the vice chair, and their legal counsel. So it was like it was like just me and three of them. Maybe it was four, I forget exactly. And essentially they framed it as, no, you need to apologize. You need to apologize publicly to everyone. And then to also provide one-on-one apologies to certain people within the board, certain people who hold influence on the institution, who do not even hold like positions within the institution, but have large sway because they are like a past president. And so I continuously thought over this, and then later it actually ended up becoming a legal mediation process. And through that entire process, there were just certain kinds of concessions that just absolutely did not make any sense for me to make such concessions to stay on as a board member. And once again, it's also that reflection of, is this worth my time and energy? Is this worth my labor after like educating them like on anti-Palestinian racism and how um, unjust and racist their framings were, to take these accusations seriously, and then to also find ways in which I should apologize for social media posts that were on my then private Instagram, that were simply standing for Palestinian human rights, and also some photos of which were just photos of mine that I took at rallies in downtown Ottawa, that I took in occupied West Bank, and shared those photos to show the world, to show actually just like my followers, which weren't that many at the time, on my private Instagram, like what Palestine was, and what it is, and how beautiful it was, and how beautiful it is. And um, to do what I could from the little position that I had of just a social media presence with about 1,000 followers at the time, like that, to humanize Palestinians, that this is what we all should be doing when we're like seeing this racist, dehumanizing rhetoric in mainstream media from our politicians, and for them to kind of take those accusations and actually go as so far as wanting me to do certain things that just really did not align with my values and principles and what I know to be true and right. Trying to find a path forward, truly trying to find a path forward, and the time and labor that went into all of that, including like an almost 12-hour legal mediation that took place in a fancy like Toronto legal firm, and we sat there going back and forth, finding a path forward, and ultimately what we landed on, I took a few days to reflect on, and ultimately it just wasn't it. And so I resigned shortly after that legal mediation, and once again decide to put my energy and time and labor to where it's deserved, and I'll continue to try to do that.
So let's turn then to what you did do, how you decided to devote your efforts amongst other activities, I'm sure, and that is you went to Gaza. Could you just start by giving us an overview of what you did? How long were you there? When did you travel there? And where were you working during that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important for me to clarify, because I think at the beginning, your intro, you said I was in Gaza for several weeks, but I was just there for 1 week. So I entered Gaza in mid-February of this year. And the journey began really in Cairo. We started in Cairo with a United Nations convoy, and entered under the permission of the World Health Organization, along with, approvals from the Egyptians, the Israelis, and the Palestinians, through the Rafah border crossing in southern Rafah. Unfortunately, that crossing has been seized, occupied, and later destroyed by the Israeli forces in May of this year. And that was when I was also trying to re-enter unsuccessfully. And now the pathway is through Jordan, through Amman, and then through historic Palestine, or so-called Israel, and then through the Kerem Abu Salam crossing in southeastern Rafah. But when I entered Gaza, it was on the eve, it was the day of the Super Bowl in the United States, and so there was belt bombing in Rafah, actually, and in Khan Yunis, and I remember seeing some of that carnage. including the body of, I believe she was 7 years old, Sidra Hasuna, who her lifeless body was just hanging off of the side of a building. And I remember seeing that at like 2 a.m. local time. And it was like 4 or 5 a.m. when we were supposed to start with the convoy in Cairo because it takes like 10, 12 hours to go through the Egyptian checkpoints in the Sinai Peninsula to get to the Rafah border. So I don't think I got any sleep that night because it was like 2 hours of shut eye. And then we made our way in, and we weren't sure if we were going to be let in because of that bombing campaign just hours before. But we entered, and initially we stayed at the Emirati Maternity Hospital in Rafah. And then later we were placed at the Tal Sultan Primary Care Clinic, and also worked at the Dar Al Fazila Primary Care Medical Point, both in central Rafah, and also visited the European Gaza Hospital to deliver medication supplies, anesthetic, surgical supplies, wound care supplies that we brought in. We were actually initially placed, we were having conversations with the World Health Organization to be placed at Al Nasser Hospital in the west of southern Gaza. But days before we entered, and also when we were there in mid-February, Al Nasser Hospital was surrounded by tanks. It was inaccessible. Multiple United Nations convoys were denied to even approach the hospital. And later we know that while we were there, the hospital was besieged. People were detained and arrested, and their whereabouts are unknown, some of whom still, and people were killed. There were mass graves, right, found around Al Nasser Hospital. But because of that, we ended up working at the primary care clinics, which was also really important because I think up until that point, there were very few like international witnesses and presence in the primary care clinic and setting. If you can recall, back in February, there were no official reports of people dying of starvation, and it was the week after we exited Gaza in late February were there the reports of confirmed deaths of people having died from starvation, young children in the north. So I remember when I was there working in the primary care clinics, and much of what I was seeing was obviously the things that much of the cases, much of the patients I was seeing were the things that everyone already talked about was bomb and burn injuries, like patients who had amputations, including eye amputations, leg amputations, and needed wound dressing changes and whatnot, like lots of different kinds of infections, including skin infections, wound infections, infections of the gut, infections of the lungs, all of which needed antibiotics. And when we arrived at the two primary care clinics, there were no antibiotics. We brought a supply and started prescribing them. That was not a solution for, at that point, a population of 1.4 million, 1.4, 1.5 million in the south and Rafah alone. But what was really striking was the patients that had signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition, really forced starvation, because we know there's been systematic actions by Israel to withhold aid to the entire Gaza Strip. And so I saw patient after patient of just like, I wish I could just prescribe you nutritious food and clean water. There was no reliable access to those things, right? And so we did what we could in treating patients with infections of all kinds, and also try to rehydrate some patients with IV fluid. There was so much IV fluid that was being brought in, but where's the clean water, right? Like, why are you waiting for children? Because children are more frail, right? They have less reserve than an adult, so they'll get sicker quicker. They'll get dehydrated quicker. They'll get malnourishment quicker than an adult. And so we were just seeing children after children, and we were poking them. The local nurses were poking them with an IV line to get fluid into them when what they needed was like clean water. What they needed was nutritious food, all of which was being systematically withheld and actually continues to be in many ways, both in the South and in the North. And actually, they're just clearing the North of any life right now.
Mhm.
I think I also just want to share that, I've said it before, but it struck me so much that a condition called like rickets disease that was, I don't even know if it was mentioned. Maybe it was mentioned like on a footnote of a slide in medical school because it's just so rare that this is severe vitamin D deficiency from malnutrition that leads to abnormal bone growth. So I saw children as young as 12 months, 14 months of age who should have been walking by their developmental milestones who are not walking. And then I saw children as old as 9, 10 years old who are previously walking and no longer walking because of severe malnutrition. And these are just this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? These are patients that were well enough to be brought in by their parent, guardian, relative, neighbor to the clinic. We couldn't go to the patients. So there are many patients who likely succumbed to their injuries or dehydration or malnutrition in their displaced tents, who couldn't go to a hospital or clinic that's working, that's operating, which is also such a rarity throughout this past year. I learned in mid-May, early May, and then later in mid-May, when I was trying to re-enter Gaza, that was when the Rafah invasion was at its peak. I learned with multiple al-Mawasi area tent massacres that took place, they stored the dead bodies from those tent massacres of just displaced people, civilians. They stored those bodies in the primary care clinic that I worked at in central Rafah, in the Tulsa Town Primary Care Clinic. I recognized the building and I confirmed it with other colleagues that that was indeed the clinic that we had all worked at some point this past year. And it was no longer operational. The entire primary care clinic was no longer operational because of the Rafah invasion and because it was, a location that could be used for something else. It was being used as a morgue to store these dead bodies because there was simply no other space to store dead bodies. And that was when they had shrouds. They had shrouds then. They don't even have shrouds now. They're using blankets, and we know how important blankets are for keeping warm when winter is around the corner. And they're also using plastic bags as they've run out of things like shrouds to honor the martyrs. And so, yeah, sorry, I could just go on and on about this, but it's just horrific to bear witness to this colonial genocidal violence and erasure, to bear witness to it on the ground in Gaza. In some ways, it was actually easier for me. It was a bit easier because being an international person on the ground bearing witness, providing healthcare, I knew it was temporary. I knew that there was someone that we had a team that was going to switch out with us, that we were going to leave. Mm-hmm. And so there's that respite for ourselves, right? There isn't such a thing for the Palestinian healthcare workers on the ground, my colleagues who continue. But because I knew that, and because we were received so graciously and with such open and warm caretaking arms by Palestinian healthcare workers, like we brought in like granola bars, protein bars, like dry food, like nuts, to be entirely self-sufficient, that we would just eat and drink the things that we brought, to not rely on our colleagues because we know how scarce food and water is. And yet they shared multiple meals with us. They demanded that we eat with them, like the hot meals that I had, like hot lentil soup, like rice, like they shared the little things that they had, and they wanted to do more. They wanted to give us a proper meal, to cook us a proper meal, to show us the parts of Gaza that they loved, to show us their homes in the north that had been bombed and besieged or were barely standing. And so when they wanted to do so much more. And there's this kind of like sense of collective um, support and care and love through all forms of resistance, right? To exist, to still take care of your community despite having lost family members, despite having lost everything, your home, all your belongings, and you continue to show up at the clinics and the hospitals is just this profound steadfastness, the samud of the Palestinian healthcare workers. Like to be around that, that was so tremendously healing and inspiring. And and yet I left that and to be in the belly of the beast of these imperial colonial nation states that are funding that ongoing genocide and to see the gaslighting happen all around me, to see the systemic anti-Palestinian racism within academic institutions, many workplaces, um, that is really, really hard to kind of wrap my head around as well. Well, it's not hard to wrap my head around, but I think it's just a very awful experience in its own way.
Mhm.
Not to compare suffering, not to, because there's nothing that can compare to what is happening on the ground in Gaza,
Mhm.
to be living through an ongoing genocide. But I would say, um, I I worry about all of us. I worry about all of us and how for those that are truly bearing witness and seeing it for what it is, and then to see all of um, the ways in which people justify and cover up the genocide, enable it and support it and outwardly support it, who are our colleagues, who are people all around us. Like we are walking amongst the monsters. And that is just such an awful, sickening reality and feeling right now.
I imagine this has had profound impacts on your own uh, aspirations as a medical professional. What's next for you? What do you now foresee yourself doing in the years ahead as a doctor?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm just taking things day by day, week by week, and really thinking about what can I do to help stop this genocide that I witnessed on the ground firsthand. And to be quite honest, everything else seems secondary to that. Like what I'll do personally, what I'll do professionally, what will that look like in a few years, in tens of years? Like I don't know. I'm not. Um, what I know is I'll continue to try to center like people who experience structural racism and oppression. That's always been my work. Why I entered medicine in the first place was to understand like indigenous health more from the lens of being a medical practitioner. I almost went into public health right after my undergrad studies when I first learned about truly first learned about like in its appropriate depth the genocide of indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island. I learned from the Haudenosaunee community members and scholars and clinicians. At McMaster University from Six Nations of the Grand River, which still is struggling with access to clean water, clean drinking water from the tap, and that's only about an hour from where I grew up in Waterloo, Ontario. And so, like when that was the reality of understanding colonial violence on the land in which I was brought up on, I felt entirely complicit to colonial violence and the genocide of indigenous peoples on stolen land, on treaty land that hasn't been respected or honored here. And that ultimately led me to Palestine because it's the same issue of colonial genocidal violence and erasure through policies and practices in all of its forms to dehumanize and to displace and ethnically cleanse Palestinians in the same way that that happened here. And to see those connections and to study those connections, um, that is what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing throughout medical school, through my master's, and I think I will continue to try to do that work in ways that make sense from my privilege of being non-Palestinian, of being non-Indigenous. What is my role as an ally or an accomplice in liberation movements? for collective liberation in all the ways in which dehumanizing rhetoric and practices affect all communities and groups, not just colonial violence, but also the ways in which, capitalism, patriarchy, all the other forms of structural oppression affect people's health. And that, I think, is my role as a trained family doctor, as someone who's been trained in public health and like structural and colonial determinants of health. So whatever that work will look like, whether it be like within a, in a more like professionalized way, or a more in a more movement space way, like that is what I will try to continue to prioritize and spend my time and energy and labor on. What does that look like? I mean, I think it continues to evolve. I think it's evolved over the past couple of months, um, and it also demands like finding the people that are like-minded and also are in it for the long run of collective liberation, because we are seeing fascist far-right movements take mainstream attention and energy, and that requires a lot of organizing to fight. And I hope I continue to do what I can in that space. And so I think what I will try my best to do is, still do a little bit of clinical medicine, and then also spend my time trying to dismantle these systems of oppression, and all the ways that are necessary with good people beside me, learning from them, and we all learn from each other.
Well, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Dr. G, and I hope we can continue the conversation in the future, and that we will have the opportunity very soon to rejoice over the end of this genocide and holding accountable of all those who perpetrated it. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for your work, and for also doing what you can to hold the government of Canada to account for its complicity in this ongoing genocide.
Thank you. And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist on November 12th, 2024.